The only fascist state which had a kind of theory about what the state would do was Italy.
Retired lawyer, मेरे ख्याल से वो active हैं अब तक वो जो lawyer हैं.
So you're dealing then as well with an archive that on the one hand is slightly in code, right, where you can't say things overtly.
While at the same time, there is a world of a difference between a Gandhi and a Savarkar, even though they may both be labeled anarchists by the British, by the colonizer. So when we're looking at these historical figures and we're trying to swim against the tide, swim against the...
The British would have termed Savarkar a terrorist.
हेलो, नमस्ते, सत श्री अकाल, अस्सलाम वालेकुम. बड़ी ख़ास एपिसोड है क्योंकि इंडियन हिस्ट्री हम पढ़ने की कोशिश तो करते हैं, जानने की कोशिश तो करते हैं, बट बड़ा कम मौका मिलता है कि टू हैव एन एकेडमिक ऑफ हर स्टैचर इन द स्टूडियो टू हैव दिस कॉन्वर्जेशन. जानकी बाखले बर्कली में पढ़ाती हैं हिस्ट्री. सरवारकर पे पहले आर्टिकल लिखा था, पहले म्यूज़िक पे भी एक बुक लिखी थी. अब 15 साल मेहनत करके सरवारकर पर किताब भी आ चुकी है. फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल नमस्कार कासाएस.
आपने मेरा जेंडर ही बदल दिया. ठीक है, वो मैं ठीक हूँ, बिल्कुल ठीक हूँ.
ये गूगल ने किया. मराठी में कैसे हो जेंडर्ड होता है?
कशे आहात.
Kashahat is for women?
No, kasa ahis would be what you would say for a man.
अच्छा.
Kashe ahat is what you would see for a woman. Or kashias.
AI कितना पेट्रियार्कल है.
हाँ, बहुत पेट्रियार्कल है.
कि उसने सिर्फ मुझे सिर्फ मेल ऑप्शन
मुझे मर्द बना दिया.
बट कैसी हैं आप?
मैं बिल्कुल ठीक हूँ. मैं बहुत खुश हूँ यहाँ आके.
कैसा कराची आपको कैसा ट्रीट कर रहा है?
बहुत बढ़िया. I'm loving coming to Karachi. I had come to Lahore some years ago, which was also wonderful, and had wanted to come to Karachi. And mauka mil gaya, so I'm just delighted to be here. And I'm looking forward to seeing more of the city today after your podcast.
Looking forward to how Karachi treats you. हम टॉपिक पे आने पहले मैं चाह रहा था सरवारकर के बारे में हम थोड़ी जाने. एंड एज प्रोफेसर्स हमारे कहते हैं कि कोई स्टूपिड क्वेश्चंस नहीं होते. मैं आई विल चैलेंज दैट नोशन बाय आस्किंग स्टूपिड क्वेश्चंस बिकॉज मुझे इतना नहीं पता. बट बिफोर वी एक्चुअली गेट इनटू द सब्जेक्ट, ये जो एक तरीका है सोचने का कि कलोनियलिज्म ने हमारा जो जहन है वो एक तरह से माइल किया, एक इट मेड अस थिंक अलॉन्ग सर्टन लाइंस. सो जो नेशनलिस्ट हिस्ट्रीज इंडिया में लिखी जा रही हैं वो एज अ रिस्पॉन्स टू कलोनियल हिस्ट्रीज हैं. तो उस चीज़ को हम डिटैच कैसे करें? बिकॉज येस दे आर ट्राइंग टू बी एंटी कलोनियल, दे आर ट्राइंग टू बी डी कलोनियल, बट जिस तरह रोमिला थापड़ भी लिखती हैं कि के एम मुंशी जैसे लोग कोशिश तो नेशनलिस्ट हिस्ट्री करने की कर रहे हैं, बट जो कलोनियल ट्रोप्स हैं वो उनमें ऑलरेडी पाए जाते हैं. तो दिस एक्टिव डी कलोनियल नेशनलिस्ट हिस्ट्री लिखने का जो प्रोसेस है उसमें भी कलोनियलिज्म सीप इन हो रहा है.
See, if you're going to write a history of a period in which colonial occupation is not just powerful, but colonialism in India, in British India, is not the outright conquest of one country by the other. Right? It is a trading company, the East India Company, which establishes a foothold. And then there's a slow creep, if you will, in three ways. Yeah, one through direct conquest, but the other two ways are not direct conquest. They're through treaties, they're through other kinds of arrangements. But bit by bit, right, over the course of 100 years, from 1757 to 1848, say, the British East India Company acquires 1 million square miles of territory. Now, this does not happen without sort of a deep interference and a knowledge of the customs, the laws, the religion, the taxation system, the legal system. And all of it gets altered in the process. So when you have 200 years of this and you're writing a history of this period, even if you're writing an anti-colonial or a decolonial history, which of course all of us historians try to write, you can't do it without taking colonialism into account. So colonialism ko hum hata nahi sakte. You cannot redact colonialism from the picture. Acha, uska bhoot sawar hai. And you have to address it. Now, the way to address it is not to accept a colonial narrative, But by the same token, you don't have to accept an anti-colonial narrative or an anti-colonial nationalist narrative, right? So the question for a historian like me and many others, most of my colleagues, is how you recognize and address colonialism, write a history which is not trafficking in either colonial or Orientalist tropes about Hindus and Muslims and so on. And yet you sort of challenge as well a kind of brute nationalism, which tends to be, in a kind of bald dichotomy. British were evil, Indians were great, or Gandhi came back from South Africa and liberated Indians. So the attempt to write, I would say, a complicated, complex history is really what all of us historians, including me, try to do, whether we're successful or not.
So when you engage in this process of writing history, and I know you've spoken about Benedict Anderson and how he's written about Jose Regal and the idea that it's not just one-way traffic. And वो एडवर्ड सईद की ओरिएंटलिज्म के बाद से एक कॉन्शियसनेस आई है कि कलोनियल हिस्ट्री जो लिखी जा रही हैं वो इम्प्लिसिट एक्सप्लिसिट बायसेस से लिखी जा रही हैं. बट देन अगर उसके रिस्पॉन्स में नेशनलिस्ट हिस्ट्रीज हम देख रहे हैं एंड बेस्ड ऑन पीपल्स आइडियाज़ और एजेंडाज और नैरेटिव्स, वन वुड प्रिविलेज वन ओवर द अदर. सो व्हेन यू आर गोइंग थ्रू दीज सोर्सेज, how are you making that determination of reading these biases into different works? It doesn't mean that we replace one with the other, so the colonial goes out, or the idea that Eastern scholars, even though I hate that binary as well, but generally, let's say Indian scholars, Indonesian scholars, have not engaged with the West at all, but that traffic, as you say, is not one-way traffic. There is engagement, there is conversation, but it's not necessarily predicated on a relationship of just them providing the theories and us getting inspired from it.
Right, okay. So the first thing is that, bias is not something I'm that worried about. I think it's inextricable. You try and work around it or against it. In my case, particularly in the Savarkar book, right, what I was letting myself be guided by were the sources in the original language, right? And so what struck me in particular, and I'm segueing to talk directly about the book, inshallah I'll answer your question along the way about how you sort of try and write this history without either falling into the sort of Orientalist or the nationalist trap, and recognizing that the kind of influence has been, or at least it's assumed to be primarily one way, right? And so the first thing that I would say to you is that I take and have taken a lot of my cues from my former teacher, Partha Chatterjee, right? And so I take them, in a sense, not less from Ben Anderson, who is an extraordinary scholar, but more from Partho's response to him on the subject of nationalism. So the idea about nationalism, for instance, was that it was invented in Europe in some capacity, and then it just trickles down, and all post-colonial or anti-colonial nations just follow. They tumble, if you will, into a kind of spiral of mimicry. Okay, what the West does, we just do. In India, thoda sa namak mirch laga ke, thoda sa masala dal ke, but fundamental alteration nahi hoti. Partho challenged this thesis, and he challenged it in fundamental ways by splitting it into the thematic and the programmatic. So the thematic of nationalism, you could say, came from Europe, but its historical articulation in India, in particular in India, was not mimetic. It was not mimetic. And Partho demonstrates this through looking at these three moments in the history of Indian nationalism. But that is and has been a very influential kind of way for me of looking at this material, where you don't say that, look, I'm going to do something which is completely divorced from any influence of the West, right? You can't. Much like colonialism hovers over us, a former colleague of mine, Shudipto Kaviraj, had responded to a similar question. He said, the ghost of Europe hovers over us. So in my case, I follow, okay, not exactly, but I follow the kind of way in which Partho approached it, which is that regardless of the thematic or the theoretical, the historical articulation of that thematic disallows a kind of easy ascription of mimicry to it. Yeah? And so that's the way I approached this book too, which was to say, there's no doubt that Savarkar, like any other intellectual of his time in the 1920s, would have read what we would today call the stalwarts of a sort of European intellectual history or a British intellectual history. He would have read Mill, he would have read Macaulay, but he would have read Nietzsche, he would have read Spencer. And Savarkar actually gives you all of those texts. You can find them in the various sources. You don't find much evidence, by the way, that he read Marx, but he did read Mill and he read Macaulay. And he clearly read Mazzini and he read Garibaldi. So he was sort of focused on reading material that was relevant to his agenda about a kind of anti-colonial nationalism. But at the same time, Shehzad, right, what struck me when I wrote the book was that the regional, local, sort of deep, deep rooting that he had in Maharashtra, in Marathi poetry, in Marathi literature, Marathi novels, that somehow got severed from all of the writing about him. And the more I went there, the more I didn't quite need to make the case for a decolonial or an anti-colonial. It just emerged in the course of writing about him by paying close attention to his literary output, his poetic output in the language that he used and over which he displayed, as I came to discover, a sort of unparalleled mastery. And so that was sort of the approach that I took for this book.
Would you attribute this severance, and to make the case for the book that a lot of his writings in Marathi, surprisingly, are not being explored?
Yeah.
Would you attribute the severance to the limitations of translation? So like, for instance, even when colonial histories are written about Mahmud Ghaznavi, even if the word is expedition, it's translated as jihad.
Bilkul.
So, and jihad has a certain connotation. It favored colonial histories to translate it as such in those circumstances. There is a word in the famous water poem. Again, I might be butchering all these words. Pramaham, which essentially means land of the ancestors, but a lot of people translate it as fatherland to make the case as it's the same
Pitrabhu.
as Pitrabhu.
Pitrabhu is
to make
translated
the case
as
that it's to invoke the same idea that Hitler invoked in terms of the Deutschland. So once an English audience is reading that imagery is evoked without necessarily making that connection to Nazism. So you going back to the original text, how conscious do you have to be that when I'm translating these words, they may appear differently to different audiences based on their understanding of history?
That's a terrific question. Thank you for asking that. So let me answer something sort of prior to this question, which is about the book, right? So when I started doing research on Savarkar, right, I thought I'd write a quick book. Well, it was not quick. It has taken far too long, but I hope it is better for having taken quite as long.
16 years?
ऐसा ही कुछ है, ऐसा ही कुछ समझे.
एक lifetime कर ले.
बहुत साल लग गए. But there were a few things that happened, right, in the course of writing about this book. The first was that I discovered usually when you set about on a topic, you set about on a topic that you think people haven't written about it, तो मैं लिख लूँ. मेरा उल्टा हुआ. I discovered, to my dismay, that everybody writes about Savarkar. Everybody writes about Savarkar. Scholars तो लिखते ही लिखते हैं. But उसके अलावा, RSS members write about Savarkar. Retired engineers, doctors, lawyers write about Savarkar. Then
तो
you
कोई
discover...
specific retired lawyer, मेरे ख्याल से वो active है अब तक, वो जो lawyer है.
नहीं, लिखने में कोई हर्ज नहीं है, but I certainly could not go in and say कि मैं पहली किताब लिख रही हूँ. ये तो नहीं है. अच्छा, the incredible, redoubtable Dhananjay Keer, who has written biographies of everybody. अच्छा, तिलक की लिखी है, अम्बेडकर की लिखी है, सावरकर पे लिखी हुई. So there was firstly the discovery that there's an enormous amount of material on Savarkar and an enormous amount in Marathi on Savarkar and biographies of Savarkar. So I had to sort of say, now what am I going to contribute to this, right? What am I going to contribute? Sheila Karandikar, one of Savarkar's associates, writes a book which is something like 450 pages in Marathi on 5 years of his life. So the writing on Savarkar, the biographical writing on Savarkar, begins somewhere in 1926 and continues till today. So there's a long, steady stream of output about Savarkar. That corpus is very undisciplined. कहने का क्या मतलब मेरा by undisciplined? उसमें it's almost primarily a kind of form of secular hagiography. Acha? It's not a critical corpus. यहाँ वहाँ है, but it's not primarily a critical corpus. And that led me to a different part of it, which is that Savarkar is generally approached in large measure because of essentials of Hindutva and what is seen as, rightfully so, as his kind of very angry writings about Muslims. He's seen in very polemical terms and he invokes polemics. So in the course of those polemics, what happens is that either you have a kind of literature that just defends him as the misunderstood nationalist, the misunderstood revolutionary, the only important nationalist figure who demanded this, that and the other, that India have an army, India have a navy, the only kind of protector of the Hindu community, right? And that's on one side. On the other side, and now I'm going to get to the question that you asked me, is the kind of writing that has him as a almost fascist, a complete fascist, a proto-fascist tending towards fascism. I don't find the term fascism that useful, personally. Not because I don't think there are strains of a kind of authoritarianism or a kind of dominance in his writing, but because, for me, the only real kind of fascist state was not the Nazi state. The Nazi state was an authoritarian state, right? The only fascist state which had a kind of theory about what the state would do was Italy. And in the Doplovaro, in the kind of very carefully choreographed architecture that would harken back to then the Third Rome, to the concept of Romanita. And the more I read about sort of Italian fascism and how the state was central to it, the more it struck me that fascism in an anti-colonial period in which the Indian state was still a figment of the imagination, it hadn't been created. We were still talking about the British state in India with the East India Company up until 1857, and then, of course, the British after that. So what did it mean to talk about fascism here? It's also the case that fascism is associated, of course, with Nazism, and it's associated then with the genocide. But all of that, the genocide, for instance, is discovered after the fact, right? It's not discovered in the early years of Hitler's rise. So the historic parallels didn't feel compelling enough for me to use it. And there are enough scholars who are doing that. So I didn't want to add to it. I wanted to do something else. So on the question of translation, which you asked me, it wasn't that Savarkar was mistranslated as fascist, right? Savarkar was termed a fascist by various scholars, okay? That wasn't the bit about translation that sort of concerned me. What concerned me, and what I was very grateful for, paradoxically, was that a great many of his Marathi works, which were central to explaining not just his appeal in Maharashtra, but beyond, were never translated and never read. So, for instance, it came as a great surprise to even members of the scholarly community, that Savarkar was what I would call a caste progressive, right? My own former teacher who I invoked, Partha Chatterjee, when he read the manuscript for me, said he didn't know anything about Savarkar's caste writings. That took me aback, because I think of Partha as sort of probably the most learned person I've ever met in my life. And so I thought, all right, if I can surprise Partha, that's a good sign, yeah? But it also came as a surprise to people that Savarkar was a poet. Not an occasional poet, not a sporadic poet, but a poet by disposition, by instinct, by training. Written 100 poems, published his poetry as a young man, socially progressive poetry. And so I was very grateful then that people hadn't read him in Marathi.
Isn't his poetry as a child which first got him into trouble?
His poetry...
While he was still in school or something?
Yes, his father actually warned him that this was poetry that he should not publish because of British surveillance of sort of revolutionaries. The main revolutionary in the family was not him, actually, it was his older brother. But because of it, the family was under surveillance. So let me just finish off. So that posed another question for me for research, which is how do you write about a figure who has spent virtually his entire life under surveillance? Which means that he's cautious about what he says and what he writes. That he destroys things that he thinks would get him in trouble. So you're dealing then as well with an archive that on the one hand is slightly in code, right? Where you can't say things overtly. And on the other, with an archive that has frequently been destroyed by the subject of your research himself or his family or his associates or his friends for fear of British arrest.
You've spoken about how Indian nationalists wrote the history of how the Italians made bombs and how they transferred guns, which was obvious to everybody that it's a manual of what you need to know, but even though it's pretending to be a history of how Italy did it. Many years ago at NYU Abu Dhabi, you were asked this question as well, that in terms of who's called an anarchist depends on who's in power and what their definition of anarchy maybe is different from ours. But when we look at these figures and when there's a movement towards re-owning our own history, looking at Indian history, we reject these labels of who gets to define violence, and James Baldwin, everybody's spoken about it as well. While at the same time, there is a world of a difference between a Gandhi and a Savarkar, even though they may both be labeled anarchists by the British, by the colonizer. So when we're looking at these historical figures and we're trying to swim against the tide, swim against the colonial histories, how do we still acknowledge the fact that a Bhagat Singh or a Gandhi or a Savarkar may have worlds of differences and still be critical of certain ideas? Not just with... How can we be critical of these figures without falling into the same tropes that we're trying to reject?
So the British would have termed Savarkar a terrorist. I don't think of Savarkar as a terrorist. I don't use that word for him. I don't... that's what they thought of. I mean, Winston Churchill thought that the suitable fate for Gandhi was the same fate that he thought would be suitable for Hitler, which is to have both of them killed under the feet of elephants, right? You just stay away from it, right? The thing about the archive is that you're dealing with the colonial archive. Of course, I'm dealing with the colonial archive. I have an entire chapter on police surveillance, the police surveillance of Savarkar, right? The archive is not something from which you get truth. Shehzad, it's not, all right? The archive is a repository of a colonial administration. It's the repository of what in a moment of, shall we say, what the British would call a riot, or the British would call, a riot in Bombay. There are dispatches being sent from one policeman to another, from one region to another. That's not giving you the truth of what happened. And in any case, truth is beyond my pay grade. I am a historian. I can read the archive. But one of the things that I had actually said in my talk at the IBA was that I also take my cue I said Partha Chatterjee, from a historian by the name of Reinhard Koselleck. And in an article, now the title of which I'm blanking on, but I will get it for you, he said the source exercises a veto power on you. And I take that very seriously. So what do I mean by that? So if I get a police report, which I did, okay, I have a police report on Savarkar. It's a compilation of material about Savarkar that a colonial policeman, a fairly high-ranking colonial policeman, will then depute his watchers on the street and the people who are doing the kind of grunt work of spying. Right? They will get together, and then somebody else compiles that into a narrative, and then somebody else cleans it up, and then it's presented as a police record. So in that sense, that police record is already a palimpsest. Yeah, it's already layers upon layers upon layers of different people compiling that information. So what do I do with it, right? How do I read it? I read it for a number of things. I read it, first of all, that the colonial police believed he was important enough to place under surveillance, right? And then I go to why would they believe that he was. So try and get into the mind of a colonial policeman. Yeah? Then you look carefully at the writing and you look at the language that is used. And now we come to your question, right? Do they call him a terrorist? Do they say he is dangerous? Why do they say he is dangerous? What is the activity that they consider dangerous? Well, they consider his poems dangerous, right? How do they know about his poems? He's writing them in Marathi. And so it's a kind of detective work that you do, right? To just take that one document, which tells you a great deal if you're slow and patient and careful enough with it, and you're not using it just to get the truth of what the British thought, right? But you're trying to get to much more than that. You're trying to situate this kind of relationship between a British policeman concerned about, quote unquote, maintaining law and order. Well, we know what that is. And trying to get the kind of rabble out of the city, or to contain something. There's almost an epidemiological language that is used here, right? So this Chitpavan Brahmin, as they describe Savarkar, who is spreading the disease of something, it's almost like the British are trying to curb it, like it's an epidemic of anti-colonial revolutionary nationalism. And so I guess what I'm saying is that in the course of doing that work, willy-nilly you actually stay away from sort of buying lock, stock and barrel into a colonial narrative anyway, because you're pulling it apart to try and see how it was put together. And that process reveals a great deal. It reveals British colonial anxiety. It reveals why they think somebody is dangerous, and why they think, for instance, Savarkar and Gandhi are on a spectrum of dangerousness, both equally dangerous. Right? And so then when I'm trying to figure out why then did they release him? They had an option. They could have used the ticket of leave system. They knew he was quote unquote dangerous. They'd been surveilling him for all of these years. Why release him? Now I can link it to something else, right? So I can link it to what I read in one of these 200 Marathi biographies about what Savarkar was saying to somebody in the Andaman Islands about the Khilafat movement and why he was worried about the Khilafat movement, what he thought was going to happen with it. And then I know that the British are placing under surveillance the Khilafat movement leaders as well. So I put these two together. And then when I get a scrap of evidence, a scrap of a letter which I found, in which there's one colonial policeman who says to another, because Savarkar has written this sort of apology letter claiming that he will not engage in political activity anymore, we cannot make use of him as we would like to. Now, what use would they have made of him? They knew exactly what he was going to say. So do they make use of him knowing that as soon as he comes back to India, or he's brought back to India, he may not say anything about the British, but he'll say plenty about Gandhi, and Gandhi is their biggest headache? So he comes back to India and he says things about Gandhi. So then I can see that for somebody who is placed under surveillance, despite the fact that he violates the terms of his agreement over and over and over and over and over again, they never rearrest him. They just let him be. And so now what I've produced for you is a critique of a colonial surveillance system in the anti-colonial national period in India. And I haven't given you the colonial line on anybody, on Savarkar or Gandhi or anybody. But I've done it through the archive. And I've done it through a reading of the archive.
So for people who are listening, their conspiracy theory ears might be perking up. So when you mention something like that as being maybe tactical by the British, would it be unfair for certain people to read into it as maybe a complicit agreement? Maybe, is there any evidence of that?
None.
It's just tactical.
You know, so अंग्रेज बेवकूफ तो नहीं थे.
I mean, arguable.
नहीं, बेवकूफ नहीं थे. You can't colonize somebody for 200 years. Right? That's not an act of stupidity. That's an act of state strategy. Okay, careful manipulation, the army or force, a combination of everything. All right, a combination of force, the instigation of collaboration, the takeover of native industries, so on and so forth. That's what I mean. Angrez बेवकूफ नहीं थे. अच्छा. And the management of a colony with a handful, 1,500 covenanted civil servants in India, 1,500 covenanted civil servants in India, running a subcontinent, colonizing a subcontinent, right? The strategy played no part in this. The strategy played no part in what the British do. I mean, we know that divide and rule is one of their policies. We know that if the Hindu-Muslim communities came together, as they did in the anti-colonial movement, okay, unki to band bajni thi. So strategically, would they not sort of try and work against that? A unified opposition to colonial rule is what any colonial power fears the most.
I think uska shayad sabse badi misal 1857.
1857.
How monumental was Savarkar in rebranding
1857
from mutiny to a war of independence?
I mean, in my opinion, very important, right? Because it's not that, it's not that he's the only one. Marx was sending dispatches saying this is more than just a mutiny. But the reconceptualization of the mutiny in, shall we say, Hegelian terms, the introduction to that 1857 volume is interesting because he's actually making a case for something which is more. The 1857 is neither a mutiny nor a full-fledged rebellion, right? It occurs in a swath from north to northeast. It's not, there's not very much happening in South India. There's not very much happening in Sindh. There's nothing happening in Bombay. All right, there's nothing happening in Gujarat. There's nothing happening in Multan.
There's a lot happening in Multan.
No, there's a lot happening in Multan. You're right. But there's not much happening in Bombay, not much happening in Sindh. So the British downplay it as a mutiny, and they downplay it as a mutiny also because they're used to such mutinies. It's not the first mutiny. There was another one in Vellore before it. But it's not a full-blown rebellion, all right? And Savarkar actually reconceptualizes it as a national rebellion or a kind of the stirrings of a national consciousness, right? Very Hegelian, and he does that in the introduction. The book is, the best way to get a book read is to ban it, okay? The best way to get a book read is to ban it. So the British ban it. So, of course, it circulates underground. Now, here's where it's very difficult to figure out exactly how many copies and how they circulated. But once again, the police archive tells you it tells you that they found copies of this book that were smuggled in between the covers of a Bible or in between the covers of an English novel. And so you can tell the importance of the book by the rapidity with which the British amend acts to catch it. Right? So they amend the Sea Customs Act, they amend the Postal Act. They give postal officers, sea customs officers enormous leeway to sort of open luggage and things like that, all in search of a book. The fact that they're so worried tells me that it was important. I know Nehru read it and said it was a little florid, but an important book nonetheless. Yeah.
Bhagat Singh had also read it. They found it there.
Yeah. So that book is important because of its sort of reconceptualization of 1857, not as a mutiny that was successfully put down by a Christian god working in concert with the British, okay, which is how it was disseminated in England, that, it was the hand of God that allowed for this victory. But that reconceptualization was certainly important. Was the book readily available, Shehzad? Ye mujhe pata nahi. I know that there's a sort of underground circulation of the book. Once it goes underground, it circulates and it gathers a certain importance.
So 1857, in Savarkar's mind, was it a unique event where the national consciousness was born? Or were his beliefs about Muslims, जो उनके हम writing में एक evolution देखते हैं, 1857 में, it's almost very complimentary of the idea that Hindu-Muslim are working together, they have a national consciousness, that doubt that the Muslims can never be loyal to this land isn't seen in that writing with that vigor or with that hatred, if I may say so. So, would you say that he views 1857 uniquely, or would you say that his ideas about Muslims in India evolved after writing that book?
So my argument is that there is not the kind of radical change that other scholars have put. And I'm bucking the trend here, right? I mean, there are very, very learned scholars, Marathi scholars, Yadi Phadke, for instance, or even Senapati Bapat, who would say, I want back the Savarkar of a previous period, not the one afterwards. Or Yadi Phadke would say his experiences in the Andamans really turned him against Muslims. That's just not an argument that has ever made adequate sense for me, right? And for a lot of reasons. So let me get to the 1857 book. There is a consistency of argument between the 1857 book Essentials of Hindutva and in his other writings. And that is simply this, which is that Muslims are in a minority in India. But if they sort of pledge allegiance and a monogamous commitment to India, then there's no trouble with them. There's no problem. It's not their Pitrabhu and Punyabhu, without a doubt. Kyunki unke पैगंबर नहीं थे in the territory of what he calls India. Okay? But so long as they are patriotic, that their loyalty is not divided, koi problem nahi hai. Okay? In 1857, he sees that. Now, in 1857, he also projects backwards into 1857 this nation that doesn't exist. Okay? There's no India in 1857. There's no independent India in 1857. But it's in his head, right? The conception of a nation is in his head. And in that conception, because the Muslims fight side by side with Hindus against the British, okay, there's no problem. When you come to the Khilafat movement, okay, that's a divided loyalty. That's a divided loyalty. And that one sends him over the edge. So my argument about him is not that a bad experience with an Afghan warder in the Andaman Islands suddenly turns him anti-Muslim when he was not anti-Muslim at all. That's not the conception I have at all. There is an everyday prejudice that all of us in India and Pakistan and then Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, we live with. You know this, right? And by prejudice, I mean we will refer to other communities in language that is not so flattering. Routinely. In India, Bengalis will refer to Tamils in one language, okay, or they will refer to Punjabis in another language, and since I'm Maharashtrian, I can tell you the language that is used for Maharashtra, and they will speak of Maharashtrians as ghatis, right, as sort of rough and tumble, not civilized like the Bengalis. So that sort of daily level of prejudice was not what concerned me. Right? I take that for granted. I don't think any late 19th, early 20th century male, female living in in British India was not full of some kind of prejudice, right? That would be silly to assume. So I don't think that a kind of anti-Muslim prejudice pops out of the sky in the Andaman Islands and then all of a sudden he turns that. What was interesting for me was the kind of excess almost that I saw in his writings. Okay, and I saw that excess coupled with the Khilafat movement. And I saw it not because of religion, which is why I completely reject the idea of him as a religious fundamentalist, among other reasons. But it is because it confirms for him, okay, something that he suspected all along, or he held all along, which is that it wasn't clear that Muslims would be patriotic. Okay, and the Khilafat movement suggests to him, even though the nation is nowhere in sight, it's nowhere around in 1920 to 24, right? But the fact that they would have an extraterritorial loyalty, okay, is what sets his rage in a completely excessive direction.
I mean, if we set aside, which the assumption you would find in every prejudice, that Muslims constitute a monolithic community, we set that aside. In this synthesis, while you make that argument that Savarkar says that as long as they're loyal to the nation, it's not a problem, but as a layman, isn't implicit in that argument that the Muslims are unique, where everybody else will stay loyal to the nation.
Yes.
Their loyalties must not be challenged.
Yes.
But a Muslim, even if he pledges loyalty to the nation, it must always be looked at doubtfully, which is maybe not found in 1857. So the fact that Muslims must uniquely be doubted and must uniquely be considered as they will never be loyal to this nation because their loyalties lie elsewhere. Their loyalties will always be divided. So you're saying that they will always stay loyal to the nation, but implicitly you're also saying, but ye kabhi honge nahi.
No, you're saying they have to demonstrate it constantly. You're saying something more than that. Not just that bhai ye honge nahi. You're going to say dikhana padega bar bar. Dikhana padega. So Muslim community has to prove over and over and over again, constantly. Like the Christian community does not have to. Like the Parsi community does not have to.
I mean, the Jews in India also don't have to.
The Jews in India don't have to.
The same arguments apply. Unki loyalty udhar hai.
But the difference between those communities is that Muslims make up a sizable minority. Achha, choti moti minority nahi hai. Okay, and the contrast for me is with Gandhi. Okay, and this is the other thing, right? Which is that when you write any history of the modern period, which is the colonial period, you can't write it without Gandhi. Okay, if the ghost of Europe hovers over us, Gandhi ke bagair, it's just not possible. I mean, then you're writing a very redacted history if you take Gandhi out of the picture. Because there is no other politician with that kind of world historical power, right? It would be like writing or trying to write the history of the African American civil rights movement and saying, "Bhaiya Martin Luther King ke baare mein nahi likhenge." Acha. And so so let me answer a slightly different question as well, which is that what I was going for in this book was not just a biography of Savarkar, okay, because there's so many written about it. I was going after the intellectual history and appeal of an ideology, all right, and how it was seeded and how it sort of stays on the back burner for a little while, for a good 40 years. And then the explanations that, Hindutva or this ideology is completely linked to liberalization, the sort of economically deterministic argument. I didn't find that. I felt much more that, to quote Hegel again, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. And if that period of the 90s is dusk, then that owl of Minerva had been perched for a good long time and had been perched for 100-odd years, and that the 1920s were a much more formative period to figure out how in this kind of shared crucible, that Savarkar was part of that conversation with Gandhi and Nehru and Jinnah and Ambedkar and so on and so forth, and Maulana Azad and Vallabhbhai Patel, and all of these figures. Halaki I've only named men here, to uske liye maaf kare. Sarojini Naidu, among others, that to sort of understand the kind of deep history of this ideology, you had to go back and look at those conversations. Now, those are not necessarily conversations, Shehzad. It's not like Gandhi, Ambedkar and Savarkar sat at a table or at your podcast and sort of
hota na podcast story
होना and duked it out कि भाई हमारा क्या मतलब है होगा हाँ पर फिर वो गड़बड़ कर देंगे ना translation की. But I could, as a historian, put them in conversation. Right. And even if the actual conversation didn't take place, I could sort of reverse engineer that conversation by looking at what was said when it was said and whether it was in response or what was happening in that period, to see how, for instance, if there was something that happened, like, for instance, no, I'll go into too much detail. I won't do that.
Communal rights 1929-30 तक जो एक decade था, directly you can link that to colonialism. So जो एक uniquely idea है, and I haven't read the book yet, but आपका जो article था उसमें I think you talk about के book Hindutva and its origins में not the one Savarkar wrote कि Hegel का outgroup in-group वो use कर रहे होते हैं, Muslims uniquely outgroup हैं. तो ये तो directly चलें सैम हनिंगटन तक ना भी जाए तो ब्रिटिश कलोनियल ट्रोप्स हैं. हाँ. तो ना चाहते हुए भी नेशनलिस्ट हिस्ट्री, एंटी कलोनियल हिस्ट्री लेते हुए भी मुस्लिम्स का जो एक व्यू पॉइंट है कि ये बाहर से आते हैं, ये इन्वेडर्स हैं. मनाने मदासिफ की भी किताब है, बुक ऑफ कॉन्क्वेस्ट, रुमीला थापड़ की भी है, विच रिजेक्ट्स दीज ओरिजिन्स नैरेटिव्स. तो सवारकर डायरेक्टली ब्रिटिश कलोनियल ट्रोप्स ही यूज कर रहे हैं अबाउट मुस्लिम्स.
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल. And that is exactly correct. And which is why, when you asked me the earlier question, conspiracy theory ke bare mein, in that sense, if I were to speculate about why they released him, okay, he was an unwitting ventriloquist, shall we say, for what was a British point of view. Okay, and I say unwitting ventriloquist because there is a kind of scholarship in India which wants to paint him as a collaborator, as a toady, as the fact that after he is brought back to India in 1924, why doesn't he just sort of go at the British, and why does he instead go after other things? Why does he go after caste? Why does he British ke khilaf kyun nahi kuch kehte? I don't have any stake in denying Savarkar the label of an anti-colonial nationalist. I mean, he was an anti-colonial nationalist. It's for that reason that he spent time in the Andaman Islands, right? The anti-colonial movement was in full swing. If he was engaged in a conversation with Gandhi about the direction that it ought to take, well, then he was in the conversation about an anti-colonial nationalism anyway, right? However, it is something that I find particularly interesting, that whether he meant to or not, he certainly furthers a British agenda of dividing and ruling. Okay. And he furthers that agenda in the face of Gandhi's sort of determination to not let it happen. And I've spent some time reading Gandhi, and it's very frustrating reading because it's like boat mein you go back and forth. There are just contradictions everywhere. But contradiction is a sort of evolution in thought, right? You don't really want to imagine that anybody, you, me, have one thought when we are 16 years old and then it stays the same and we don't change it. But what was also clear is that for all his flaws, and Gandhi's flaws are sort of exposed routinely, that nationalism for Gandhi was about people. It was not about territory, not about landscape, not about blood. It was about people. And so Gandhi's support for the Khilafat movement is not a deep, learned support for what the Khilafat was, kahan se aayi, kahan gayi, uska kya hua, Turkey mein kya ho raha tha, CUP ke baare mein kya ho raha tha. Oh, Gandhi is not concerned about any of those things. For him, his Muslim brethren, that's the word he uses, okay, want it. It matters to them, and therefore it should matter to us. Okay, and there's a very kind of almost a family rhetoric there. Okay, this is one of our family members. उन्हें चाहिए तो उनकी support करनी चाहिए. It's sort of astonishingly simple in that sense, right? There is, you sometimes you search for a more complex reason in Gandhi, and then you come down to it's a simple reason for Gandhi. हमारी ही बिरादरी है, उन्हें चाहिए, उनका सपोर्ट करना चाहिए.
तो इसमें खिलाफत मूवमेंट आई थिंक बड़ा एक इंटरेस्टिंग जंक्चर है, बिकॉज एट दैट टाइम मैं पाकिस्तान के पर्सपेक्टिव से बात करूँ, फॉर पाकिस्तान, even though he should not be, Gandhi is considered a villain in our story. We don't like him too much. But he's the one standing with Khilafat movement. Yes. The father of Pakistan, Jinnah, is criticizing Gandhi for mixing religion with politics.
Yes.
He's saying, क्या तुम Khilafat movement का साथ दे रहे हो? तो religion politics mix होना नहीं चाहिए, दोनों चीज़ें बर्बाद हो जाएंगी. Who later founds Pakistan based on the two-nation theory. And then you have Savarkar, whose opinions get a bit more entrenched during this time. So would you say that it was just that love, because writings में तो यही मिल रहा है, but it's also a bit tactical like that कि अगर हमने एक ही मुल्क बनाना है, अलग नहीं होना, anti-colonial इनमें साथ चाहिए, so it also makes sense to support.
किसके बारे में पूछ रहे?
For Gandhi to support a large-scale Khilafat movement tactically as well, right?
I'm sure it was tactical, because I would not want to deify Gandhi. But it's more than tactical. Okay, it's more than tactical. Gandhi's writings on Khilafat are also linked to cow slaughter, which he, in really interesting ways, tries to remove from the language of transaction. Okay? So when pushed to say, Bhai, why don't you tell Muslims to stop cow slaughter and then we'll support Khilafat? He actually rejects that. He rejects it in the language of a kind of anti-transactionalism. He was like, no, we're not going to make any of those transactions. Okay? It has to be a different kind of connection. It has to be a kind of solidarity with what our brethren want. And I will not put cow slaughter on the table as a transaction. But I believe, and then this is Gandhi, quixotic as always, right? That they will be persuaded out of love for us to automatically give it up. Okay, and so this is what I said. When you read Gandhi, he's difficult to tackle, but it's very, very stark in contrast to what Savarkar writes about Khilafat. For Savarkar, it just confirms that there is a kind of, shall I say, a drive to sovereignty for him that is inherent with the Muslim community, that, their kind of desire, the exceptionalism of Muslims for him is that they make up not a minority community, but because of this kind of extraterritorial loyalty, which is always a potential for them, always, okay, which is now, for instance, demonstrated in the support of the Khilafat movement, then the Muslim community is no longer a minority, because then it's the community of Muslims worldwide. Okay, and against that, then Hindus are in a minority. So what Savarkar does, and when I say skillfully, Shehzad, understand what I mean. I'm not praising him, right? Nor am I justifying it. I'm just excavating it, right? What he does skillfully is reconstruct a majority community as a minority community and a minority community as a majority community. So that the language of victimization and anger that he will then bring into the conversation, okay, has the kind of passion of a minority community when it's the majority, when it's 84% majority. Okay, I set about trying to figure out, how do you do something like that? How does this ideology take hold, right? Because this is so clearly not what Gandhi and, liberal secularist as Nehru is, it is so not what Nehru and liberal secularist as Jinnah was at the time, so not what Jinnah was saying, right? And it's an ideology on the margins. Well, until 1937, Savarkar is restricted to Ratnagiri district. From 1937 to 1942, he's head of the Hindu Mahasabha. 1942, he keeps the Hindu Mahasabhaites aloof from the Quit India movement, which is the single largest anti-colonial movement in India. Okay, Then he's implicated in Gandhi's assassination in 1948. From 1948 onwards, he's acquitted because they can't find hard proof. He lives in semi-seclusion until he dies in 1966. And yet, right, a figure who's on, shall we say, the margins of the mainstream, has such an enormous impact in his local region. And the ideology with which he comes to be affiliated, has such a, iski lambi dum hai. Okay, so those were the puzzles that I was trying to get to. So in that sense, I wasn't really concerned about sort of writing an anti-colonial history. I'd done all of that in my first book. तो उसे मैं पीछे छोड़ गई थी, वो कर लिया था मैंने. This one was much more a kind of an intellectual biography of an ideology and a phenomenon. And how do you write that? And how do you do it when the archive is hidden? How do you do it when the archive is destroyed by the person who's your object? How do you do it when the autobiographical materials are actually very slim? बहुत ज़्यादा नहीं है. अच्छा. How do you do it when the biographical material about him is immense? And how do you recognize, or how do you figure out the way in which all these incredible contradictions sit together, right? Incredible caste progressivism. Incredible, right? When I'm reading him about caste, I'm saying, wow, this is, just get rid of caste. Get rid of it. Wholesale nikal do.
मुझे इस कास्ट और उस पर मैंने पूछना है, बट मे बी एज एन आउटसाइडर आई कीप इन्वोकिंग कलोनियलिज्म बिकॉज मैं कलोनियल हिस्ट्री पढ़ता हूँ, मैं इंडियन हिस्ट्री इतनी ज़्यादा नहीं पढ़ता, तो मेरा जहन उसी तरह से सोचता है कि अच्छा यार, इवन दिस आइडिया कि एक हिंदू ओप्रेस्ड मेजॉरिटी थी और मुस्लिम इन्वेडर्स आए थे, एंड इस मेजॉरिटी को मुस्लिम से बचाने के लिए ब्रिटिश एज लिबरेटर्स बनकर आए. That's classic colonial history being retold in a different way. At least that's how I'm viewing it. So this, and we've already rejected that at the start, the idea कि हम लोग intellectual नहीं हैं और सब वहाँ से आ रहे हैं. But to be fair, these notions of a nation state, वो Westphalian के बाद, democracy के बाद से बना है. So even though the movement towards sovereignty, the movement against the British sovereign nation, ये उनके खिलाफ हो रही है, but isn't it all coaxed in the same language?
How are you going to get away from that? You're in an anti-colonial struggle, okay? You have to engage it. How do you can't actually, in my opinion, you can't write an anti-colonial history which is entirely a nativist history. If you do that, you're going to write a redacted history.
But uska jo ek base assumption hai, which I'm maybe challenging in a way, and Benedict Anderson, Imagine Communities, I'm sure everybody's read that. So when Savarkar is invoking that notion of a nation, that idea is questionable as well, that ऐसा तो नहीं है कि खैबर पख्तूनख्वा से लेके बंगाल तक एक nation था, या people had the idea of a nation, and then Savarkar himself says that nation building is more concerned with geography over history, and history is a tool to be used. So he's not concerned with being historically accurate as well.
No, not in the least.
So it's a project of this myth making of a nation. It's almost creating this nation in an imagination, which is based on borders of the British Empire. So इनके जहन में ये ज़रूरत है कि हम मुल्क बनाएंगे एंड उसकी एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन होगी, जिससे बैक ट्रैक करके ये नेशन का आइडिया इन्वेंट कर रहे हैं फॉर दैट जस्टिफिकेशन, और डू यू फील लाइक कि नहीं, वाकई एक मिथिकल आइडिया ऑफ द नेशन इनके जहन में पैदा हो गया था, विच हिस्टोरिकली मे बी people in India or this region have not thought about this land as one nation?
So let me try and get your question. Are you saying that did Savarkar inherit his understanding of the nation from a European conception? Yes, of course. Everyone did. Okay? Which is why right at the beginning I went to Partha Chatterjee. Okay? Again, that is that's a base fact for me. Right? Just as it is right now a base fact that we play cricket in India and Pakistan, and we speak in English and in Urdu. Okay? I have no interest in trying to figure out a way in which I could excise cricket from India and Pakistan, or never speak English again. Right? In that sense, let me refer to another one of my friends and colleagues who was also asked a question similar, and this is Dipesh Chakravarti. And he had responded to this question by saying, look, aren't you always going to tap into or reproduce a colonial problematic or a Eurocentric problematic? If, for instance, you refer to Heidegger all the time and you refer to Hegel and you don't refer to any sort of quote-unquote Indian scholars. And Dipesh had responded in a way that I found interesting. He said, I have neither guilt nor gratitude for this, right? I'll use whatever I want. And I'll use, I'll use a Sanskrit text and I'll use Heidegger. It's, in a sense, you escape that problematic by not being slavish to it, right? By not being slavish to it, by in some ways, shall I say, reappropriating its power. To say, I will use whatever I want, and I won't use it in the way that you tell me I must use it. Okay? Robin Kelly, for instance, famous African-American historian, went so far as to say, look, I don't think of Marx as a finished product. I think of it as a work in progress. So I will expand on the work of Marx. Okay. And so then the conventional Marxists, the dogmatic Marxists, the Eurocentric Marxists will tell me, you've got Marx wrong. And I'll be like, yeah, maybe so. Okay. So that's a different act of appropriation, Shehzad, is what I'm saying to you, right? And so when I write a history and I say Savarkar is interested in an anti-colonial nationalism, for instance, if that's what I'm saying, okay, I'm not saying, therefore, Savarkar is not trafficking in an idea that has come from Europe. What I will say is, let me look at the way in which he works that idea, right? The thematic programmatic divide. And it is in the programmatic, in the way he works that idea, that you, to the extent that you can, sever some of that connection or some of that or sever some of the anxiety of influence that you have about whether or not this is coming from the West, from the colonial encounter, and so on. Does that make sense?
Where my struggle comes from. So let's say somebody in Pakistan makes the argument that from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa to Bengal, all of this should be a Muslim nation. They might invoke some
linguistic nationalism or religious nationalism.
Religious nationalism. Yeah. They might reappropriate a hadith to say that this is what the Islamic injunction was. That doesn't exist in the case of this consciousness of Indian. So somebody is Savarkar sitting in Maharashtra. Where does he get this notion that from Balochistan to Bengal, this is historically an inseparable part of this mythical nation that has already existed? Or he is conscious of the fact that he is deliberately inventing that for political purposes? Or does he believe that, no, this genuinely...
No, I think he believes it, because there is the Akhanda Bharat
coming from?
So he does some very, very odd philological things, all right? So, for instance, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but he has a sense of a Hindu empire in the pre-British period, in the pre-Islamic period, that extended far and wide, all right? As far as Zanzibar, which he considers the Anglicization of Hindu Bazaar, okay? Or that a kind of Hindu imperium extended, and by Hindu he means not religious, by the way. It's not about religion at all. He will talk of Guatemala as Gautamalaya, okay? The abode of Gautam Buddha. And so he will then look at the fact that the Ramayana goes into Indonesia, right? Or he looks at Angkor Wat and looks at the spread of that, what the Sanskrit cosmopolis, for instance. And that for him is tied into this conception of a Hindu imperium, right? Is it historically accurate? Of course not. Is it available for historical fabrication? Yes. That's what he does. That's what he does, right? So your Khyber Pakhtunkhwa to Bengal has an analogy here. So for him, okay, it is the Indus is one border for him of Aryavarta. Okay. Where does he get the term Aryavarta? Aryavarta he gets from any number of Sanskrit texts. What does Aryavarta mean? Aryavarta literally means the land in which a sacrifice can be conducted. How was that land acquired in those periods? Through the horse sacrifice. Jahan bhi ghoda jaye, wo zameen humne hadap li. Acha? So it's in that sense, he makes a very idiosyncratic, right? And I say idiosyncratic because it's not historically provable. But because the words are there, and right, and this is why he is part of what we would call the Hindu right? Because the word exists, because he can find Aryavarta somewhere, or he can find Bharatvarsh somewhere, or he can find that word somewhere, right? He will trace a kind of connected history. Right? And he will trace that connected history, but he does not put it in the language of a disciplinary history, which is only emerging in the period that he's back in India. Right? You didn't have disciplines in which you got PhDs in Indian history. A PhD in Indian history for generations was the history of the British in India. It wasn't Indian history. Right? So who was writing these things? There were Sanskritists who were doing translations, and there were other people who were trying to sort of excavate the records. But they weren't writing the kind of narrative history that I'm writing now. Not then. What was being written was historical novels, right? Historical novels about great heroes like Shivaji Maharaj and the retaking of this fort and the retaking of that fort. Okay. And it is that idiom that he uses to take his sort of philological, ruminations about, the glorious periods of Chandragupta Maurya and this one and that one, to posit this kind of unbroken history.
Would you say that he almost invented this modern Hindu identity? Because again, if you read the laws of Hindustan, the idea of what a Hindu is, historically, if I'm wrong, please do correct me, is not tied as such to a religion. It's the people of the Indus, Hindu, people who live here. So him defining that, or at least attempting to, or at least making that groups, that you may be Jain, you may be Aryan, all these differences, let's set those aside. Now all this will be categorized as Hindu, and then Muslims become the out group. Would you say he's the first one to make that definition, or at least that's how Hindu, or what we now use the term as Hindu, has come to be, is because of Savarkar?
I would say he's certainly important in that, right? Is he the first? No. There were others who were sort of working to produce some kind of unified Hindu identity, yeah? But also remember that you're coming off a period of so-called reform, right? Which is, you're coming off a period which begins, say, with the founding of the Brahmo Samaj in the beginning of the 19th century and ends towards the end of the 19th century with the back to the Vedas, Arya Samajis, right? Turn the Vedas demotic. So there is this kind of like, hum hai kaun, and linked to that is how do we kind of get rid of the practices in our community that are so abhorrent, right? So there's that kind of reform within, shall we say, broadly speaking, the Hindu community. At the same time that you've got Ambedkar saying, that Hinduism is just completely, it has no principles, right? It is entirely about ritualism and the control of that rituals by Brahmins. So there's an incredible critique at the same time. What Savarkar does in all of this, right, and he does it with particular punch, he does it with particular force. So, I'm very reluctant to make people the creators of the origin, because you can always find somebody else who says, na? But he's certainly the one who I think goes the furthest in replacing Hindu as a religious designation with Hindu as an ethnicity. Okay. And so it doesn't matter what your caste is. Tum Bengali ho ya Tamil ho, tum Hindu ho. It doesn't matter tumhari jaat kya hai. Acha, tum Hindu ho. So if I were to put it in a very pithy phrase, I would say that for Savarkar, caste, all of it, not just untouchability, sara ka sara. Acha? Caste and untouchability were regressive. Hindu ethnicity is progressive. Mane, looking to the future. That, I think, he does with more force than anybody else does. All right? And the way he does it is to use the language of the epics, to use the language of literature. So he literally will turn the characters in epic poetry and epic literature into what I've elsewhere called peripatetic sort of markers of the territorial nation, right? So where did Ram go? He went down to Sri Lanka. Okay, so that's also India, okay? And where do you think the Mahabharata was fought? Well, that's India. And where, by the way, who went to Attak? That's also India. Indus Valley to the... So he uses epic literature, he uses poetry, okay, to sort of mark out that territory and to populate it with not... And this is, of course, a literary enterprise, right? But it's got a certain power to it because he couched it in poetic language. And so Hindu as an ethnic identity replaces Hindu as a religious identity. He's not interested in religion at all. He's not interested in it. For him, the main problem with it is that it has ascribed a false divinity to caste divisions that keep Hindus from recognizing their commonality and has allowed Muslims to convert Hindus.
इसमें आजकल काफ़ी लोगों ने सावरकर को co-opt भी किया हुआ है who might believe in those strict binaries, which I would love for you to speak about. If I'm not mistaken, Savarkar was quite critical of Brahmin elitism.
Yes.
And you've spoken about the poem that he wrote about the orphan child and how critical he was of these ideas. So it's interesting that this community now owns...
Well, I suspect they don't read him. He wrote a series of essays called Jatyuchedak Nibandha, all right, which are essays on the abolition of caste. And, that is, wo maine jab padha, I had to stop for a while and sort of completely redo my chapter. Because I had initially just written a chapter about saying, there's just instrumental. His sort of caste critique is just strategic. It's just instrumental. He's doing it just because he thinks that casteism allows for people to be easily converted away from the Hindu fold. I don't think that's wrong, okay, but I don't think it's comprehensive. I don't think that's full. I don't think that's a complete explanation. And in reading these essays, okay, there is not a single... I'm sorry, I'm going to not finish that sentence and I'm going to start with a different one. One of the reasons, ये मैं बहाने बता रही हूँ आपको, one of the reasons this book took so long for me to write is that when I read Savarkar, there's not a single essay, Shehzad, जिसमें there are not Sanskrit quotations. अच्छा, uncited. अब uncited तो होंगे ही क्योंकि some of it he's writing in prison, some of it he's writing, in a kind of regional arrest. He's not exactly allowed to go into the archive or the library. In any case, वो archive जो बन रहे हैं, you could not go in there without a colonial patron. Which colonial patron was going to take Savarkar, who's under house arrest and considered a dangerous revolutionary, to a colonial archive of all things? So he's writing a lot of it from his memory. तो पहले तो उसकी दात देनी पड़ती है. You have to actually recognize that, this is somebody of a prodigious intellect. Like him, don't like him. You recognize that he has a prodigious intellect. So every one of his essays is filled with one or another Sanskrit quotation. So after the fact, I became his research assistant. Okay? I was hunting out, bhai, ye kahan se aaya, ye kisne likha hua, iske maine kya hai. So I was working like, a first year Sanskrit student with my Sanskrit colleagues, Bob Goldman, Madhav Deshpande. Now, because of this, right, even when he writes about caste, for instance, liberally scattered through his writings, okay, are quotations from the Manu Smriti, quotations from the Vedas, quotations from the Mahabharata, quotations from the Ramayana, and they're all there. Then there are quotations from the Purans. Now there are 18 major Purans. I don't know what they are. Okay, so I have to go ask my Sanskrit colleague, kaun se Puran likha hua hai? Then he would do things like he would use one line from one Puran, one line from another. Or he would rephrase the second line from the Puran, but in such a way that वो मीटर के हिसाब से वो जज जाता था वहाँ. अब ये सारा रिसर्च करने में मुझे बहुत देर लग गई. But what I did discover was that he used all of these texts and he pulled them apart. He pulled every last one apart. So he would go to the Vedas and explain to his readers, who are middle class Maharashtrian upper caste men and women, that there is no such thing as caste in the Vedas, that there is what we would call miscegenation in the Vedas, that the author of the Mahabharata, if we traced his genealogy, would be an untouchable in his time. Okay, that if you looked at Ram's trajectory through the Ramayana and you looked at किन किन के हाथों से राम ने खाना खाया, then you would say कि आज के कास्ट हिसाब से he was eating food from all the people that you would otherwise not say would, हमारी जात चली जाएगी or something like that. So there was a kind of seriousness about his critique of caste. Okay, अब तुम मुझे कहोगे कि भाई हेगल का भी वही क्रिटिक था कास्ट के बारे में, मार्क्स का भी वही क्रिटिक था, तो इज ही नाउ यूरोसेंट्रिक इन दिस? And I would say to you, sometimes even if it is an Eurocentric critique, for Savarkar and for Gandhi and for Ambedkar, these critiques of caste were necessary. They were absolutely necessary, right? Because caste had produced the worst thing in the world in India, which is untouchability. Okay? Untouchability. How is it that you could consider an entire community untouchable? Okay? But this is something that Gandhi goes after in his own way, Ambedkar goes after in his own way, and Savarkar goes after in his own way too. Okay? And he does it in these essays in a manner that made me rethink. Okay? Made me rethink the question that, is he doing this just strategically? No. Okay? He wasn't doing it just strategically. But at the same time, I would then counter by saying, what reform is not instrumental? Up now, women's rights movements has a goal at its end, right? You want certain rights. You're not just engaging in the conversation about women's rights just to have a conversation about it. So that kind of contradiction was equally a part of Hindutva in his mind. The kind of sort of gender progressivism, okay? His gender progressivism was not saying, औरतों को तुम वापस जाओ किचन में बैठो. His gender progressivism was तलवार उठाओ जो कर, suffragettes को देखो इंग्लैंड में. अच्छा, वो भीख मांगने नहीं गई हैं, वो कह रही है हमारा हक हम लेकर छोड़ेंगे. That's what he admires. That is not what I'm sorry, but it's not what Nehru admired or Gandhi admired or anybody else admired. So you've got these incredible contradictions. This kind of anti-Muslim sentiment, the othering of the Muslims, as you put it, entirely in line with a British colonial and an Orientalist conception. Okay? And then this incredible caste progressivism, gender progressivism, and a kind of very savvy recognition that history matters to Aam Janta. Matters to everybody, okay? It's not just something जो university के department में हम पढ़ाते हैं. And that if you're going to reach that group of people, okay, you don't reach them. I'm not saying that Savarkar thought this comprehensively, but you reach them not in an academic language, but you reach them in the language of poetry, in poetic phrases, that history should be, zabardast, it should be passionate, okay?
So for him, doesn't that become the most important thing? Not actually what history or religion is, because I think Christopher Jafferley called him an atheist. I don't know if you would agree with that notion.
I would not.
But one would, okay, so if he's not an atheist, but he's not a religious fanatic, fundamentalist as well, as he's using history, he's also using religion, or would you say no, it's a genuine attempt at showing that this is what the religion says, or it's still tactful in a way that let me get this certain ideas out of the religion because it will help the movement, or it will help reform Hindus as we are today, not necessarily what the Vedas originally say? So
he never engages theology. He does not engage Hindu theology. And yet he will quote from Advaita Vedism. All right, he will quote from it. But he quotes from it, from notions of absolute Brahman, to say, if, for instance, everything comes from the same source, then the cow and the donkey come from the same source. So why do we worship the cow and not the donkey? Okay? So he clearly knows this literature. Is he an atheist? He never actually says, there's a word for it, Nastik. I don't read that in his language. I don't read it. I read rationalism. I read a kind of rationalist dismantling of superstition, what he calls andhavishwas, blind faith. I see a rationalist dismantling of, इंडिया में भरे पड़े हैं होली मैन, साधु, फकीर वगैरह वगैरह.
इसके कमेंट सेक्शन में भी मुझे उस वक्त हंसी इसलिए आ गई थी, अंधविश्वास बोला. मैं कमेंट सेक्शन में इस वक्त बहुत अंधविश्वास नजर आ रहा होगा जो लोग ट्रोल करने आएंगे.
वो मैं देखूंगी भी. अच्छा. So is this atheism? I'm again, like with fascism, I'm uncomfortable with this term. So in some sense, when you say, how do you not write an anti-colonial? How do you write an anti-colonial history without falling into those traps? So atheism, fascism are two of those terms that for me just don't work in this context. And if I were to use them, then I would consider myself as doing what you would not want me to do, right? Write a kind of history that is just a certain influence is too powerful on me. I would say he's an agnostic, perhaps, but a sentimental relationship to ritual. Beti ki shaadi hui, to, he sat down, performed the rituals. No atheist would do that, right? But at the same time, the sacred thread which he had, right? Because all twice-born boys go through the ceremony. He quipped about it. How do I know this? Because his son wrote about it. His son writes about it in a biography of his own father, that Savarkar used the sacred thread, जिसमें उन्होंने अपनी चाबियाँ बांध के रखी हुई थी, saying कि this must be, because it's the sacred thread, it's a very strong cotton. So there's at the same time, the people that he went after more than anybody else were the Sanatanis. The Sanatanis who believe in eternal religion and are Vedists. He went after them hammer and tongs. I would not call him an atheist. I see no use in calling him an atheist. I don't see the stake in calling him an atheist, right? I'm working much more with what he said about himself, not because it was the truth, like I said, but because I want to figure out why he would sort of write of himself like that.
It's interesting that Savarkar, like the modern Hindu nation as it's being formed, he might be considered one of the most influential ones, if not the father. If you look at Pakistan, Jinnah created it. Was Jinnah a devout Muslim? I don't think anybody can argue that, even if we don't go to the extent of arguing whether he was an atheist or agnostic. He was not a devout Muslim. If you read The Jewish State by Theodore Herzl, he's arguably an atheist. Yeah. He's using Judaism as a tactful way. And what he's saying is practical considerations of building a nation state are much more important than religious dogma. Right. If we get Argentina, we'll build it in Argentina. What we're concerned about are practical considerations. So it's interesting that these three figures,
they are,
who are considered fathers of national religious states, may not be so religious in their personal lives.
The one who was more religious was Gandhi, right? Gandhi is a Vaishnav. Very taken with the demotic Ramayana, right? But Gandhi too does not need, if you will, Shastric authority, right? He doesn't refer to the Vedas. What Savarkar does is he occupies, there is also one of the things that if you remove Savarkar from Maharashtra and just, make him just the one who wrote these historical works, right? You don't quite recognize that Savarkar is sort of stepping into a fairly deep tradition of this kind of critical writing about Brahmanism, about Brahmins, that has a long history in Maharashtra, right? Lokahitavadi's Shatapatre, for instance, is filled with this kind of sort of criticism of Brahmins and Brahmin privilege and Brahmin power. So Savarkar writes in that mode as a kind of Pandit Shastri, critical of his own tradition, right? Critical of Brahmins, Brahmanism, critical of Andhavishwas, critical of this kind of almost a kind of literary illiteracy for him, literary illiteracy. Right? So when he's writing about the Manusmriti, he's writing directly to women. Okay, and he writes a piece called Manusmriti Til Mahila, the women of the Manusmriti. Right? He takes the Manusmriti, for heaven's sake, and he writes directly to women about, among other things, okay, funeral rites, Shraddha rituals, and what meat was cooked. And what meat was cooked in the Manusmriti, and what those women would have had to have cooked. In a sense, saying to them, if you want to be Sanatani, you're going to need to cook the meat of boars. You're going to need to serve the meat of turtles and all of these other animals. Right? So that's the kind of literary criticism that he does.
People have sent in a few questions as well. Let me just get to those. मैंने subtly ये shirt भी पहन ली थी, आपने अब तक recognize नहीं किया. Especially for this podcast, I picked out this color.
I have just assumed it is this color.
How the Hindu Mahasabha led by him viewed the Muslim League and Congress's politics?
Very negatively.
How did Savarkar view communists? Same answer.
It's pretty much the same answer. There is an odd quip by Yadi Phadke, who's now passed away, but he's one of those extraordinary Marathi historians of not just India, but Maharashtra as well. And, this is undocumented, but Savarkar was not modest. Okay, he admitted of no influence on him. And Yadi Phadke has a quip when he said somebody had asked Savarkar. So I'm telling the person who's asking this question, basically hearsay, okay, not evidence-based hearsay, that somebody had asked, Yadi Phadke recounts a story, ki somebody had asked Savarkar, ki, someone is asking me, have you read Marx? And Savarkar's quip was, somebody should ask Marx whether they've read Savarkar.
तो सलमान खान डायलॉग है ये तो.
बड़ा arrogant सा dialogue है.
How did he stay away from August uprising, Bharat Chodo movement, despite the large-scale violence by the British on Indians, while he himself had been a staunch revolutionary once? Yeah,
good question. This is partly his kind of rejection of Gandhi. Okay, and his belief that Gandhi was not that. Partly because, even Quit India in theory starts off as a non-violent movement. It doesn't stay non-violent, obviously. And Gandhi recognizes that he has no control over it. But it's about Gandhi. I mean, it is about opposition to Gandhi, to what Gandhi is doing in politics, and just a severe rejection of everything Gandhian.
How did he view the RSS?
The RSS was founded in Nagpur in 1925, and he would have viewed it with favor. All right, he would have viewed it with favor because of two things in its time. One, that it was actually telling, it was a cultural organization, right? The RSS is not a political organization in that it never fields candidates for any elections. It's a socio-cultural organization. But he would have viewed it with some favor, not least because it was perceived by him as a kind of remasculinization of the Hindu community, which had sat around for too long, okay, reading Sanskrit texts and not being a sort of active part of the nation.
How Bhagat Singh viewed Savarkar?
As a fellow revolutionary initially. I mean, Savarkar was widely admired as a revolutionary, even if his views were not always to everybody's liking.
May I add some apolitical questions?
Of course.
Okay. Did Savarkar have PTSD?
I don't know how to answer that question. I think it is fair to say that his health, okay, and I'm getting this from the police archives, that I think it's fair to say that he was not somebody of robust sehed, and that the years in prison did not help that. So from what I read, okay, about people who were with him after he left prison or was in Bombay after 1947, is that he struggled with his health.
I mean, he was tortured a lot. So
we don't know that.
Wasn't he kept in solitary confinement for a long time?
Yes, but we don't know that, there was physical torture. We don't know.
That's torture in
itself. अच्छा ठीक है.
उस तरह.
हाँ, उस तरह का emotion.
6-7 महीने solitary में रखा ना उनको अकेले. I mean,
I mean, he was not treated well, but I don't know that he was treated any differently than all the other political prisoners in the Andaman Islands. Okay, and the reason I say this is that there is a kind of narrative about Savarkar. He's unique in being tortured, and that's all I'm saying. That he was treated as a political prisoner.
Why was he kept over there when Nehru and Gandhi were kept in palaces? So you're rejecting कि ये
No, Nehru and Gandhi were not members of revolutionary associations, nor were they ever affiliated with bomb throwing or political assassinations, which Savarkar and his brother were.
The Scotland Yard spread a rumor that he was homosexual. No, okay. Did he actually have any extra... I'm going to butcher this, so please forgive me. Ne majasi ne parat mathrubhumila sagara
ne majasi, yeah.
Oh ocean, please take me back to my motherland,
right.
my soul
ne
is
majasi
willing.
Ne mathrubhumila.
This is what he wrote while the British were dragging him to different shores.
No. This is what he wrote when he was at the seashore in Bristol. He saw the ocean and he wrote a poem. And the poem basically sort of invokes the ocean and says, take me back home.
Who was the actual mastermind of the two-nation theory? Sir Syed Ahmad Khan or Veer Damodar Savarkar in 1921?
Savarkar is not interested in a two-nation theory.
ये भी contradiction नहीं है, this idea that the Muslims will never be loyal to you, but the
they
Muslims
must stay.
Should not be allowed to build a separate nation. They should stay as a minority.
That's right. You got it exactly right, Shehzad. You know, this is like, you can ask why is this...
The famous anchor in Pakistan who says, kya ye khula tazad nahi hai, which is, isn't this an open contradiction?
It is, and is it a contradiction? It is a contradiction only insofar as you would say that no country or nation should have a minority population. If there are minority populations, then the state, I think, is obligated to figure out how that minority population can live and is represented, right? In Savarkar's view, there was no reason for the Muslims to leave, okay? But there was a reason for them to recognize that they were now going to be a minority population.
Who do you see as today's Veer Savarkar?
I don't.
Ask her what is Hindutva and why does Hindu Rashtra mean as per her and as per Savarkar?
Hindutva means Hindu-ness. Hindu Rashtra literally means a Hindu nation.
How come Savarkar was atheist and Hindu at the same time? I think it हमने address कर लिया है. Can you ask what made her feel that she needs to write a book on this topic?
I don't know what made me feel that. I thought I was going to write a quick book, okay? I finished my first book and my husband and my former teacher, they said, you know, तुम मराठी पढ़ती हो, तो सावरकर पे एक जल्दी से किताब लिख लो, किसी ने लिखी नहीं है. मैंने कहा ठीक है, लग गए 15 साल.
Did Savarkar really predict the 1962 war?
I have no idea.
Please discuss the case of arrest and return of Savarkar, France versus Great Britain in the Permanent Court of Arbitration.
So he jumps out of a porthole when the boat that is carrying him from England to India for trial, he jumps out of the porthole in Marseille. He demands political, what's the word?
Asylum?
Asylum, thank you. And French socialists are very taken with this idea. And so that case is taken to The Hague and it is rejected. And so he is returned to the British detectives and brought back to India for trial.
How inclusive was his conception of Hindu Rashtra? Did he differentiate between Hindu Rashtra and Hindu Rajya? How does he fare in comparison with his other right-leaning contemporaries?
Could you repeat that? That went by too fast.
How inclusive was his conception of Hindu Rashtra?
So stay with that.
Okay.
How inclusive? Completely inclusive on the one hand. All right, all you had to do was pledge great love.
Did he differentiate between Hindu Rashtra and Hindu Rajya?
Well, Rajya means rule. Okay, Rashtra means nation. We're talking about the modern period. So he's not talking about kinghood, kingship, right? But whoever this is who is asking this, you know, the interesting thing about all of these thinkers is that I would say Nehru had a conception of the state, and he had a conception of the state partly because he traveled to the Soviet Union. And in the early years of the Soviet Union, okay, it made great leaps, okay, a great rise in women's education, a kind of breaking of a number of boundaries and borders, a kind of opera available to everybody where previously it was only available to the elite. So Nehru's very taken with that. And that notion of the state as engineering large-scale projects, right? Iron and steel projects, dam projects, and 5-year plans, the developmental state. I think Nehru has that conception. But I don't read a theory of the state in Savarkar. I don't read a theory of the state in Gandhi. Okay, so in that sense, it's not about Hindu Rashtra and Hindu Rajya as you're arguing. It's not that he wants one Hindu ruler back on. He doesn't really have a conception of that.
But there is this eulogization of Hindu rulers like Shivaji.
In previous, but there's no suggestion that that's what we should go for, which is the important thing to recognize. That in that sense, all right, it's difficult to say that Hindutva is completely recidivist. Right? It's not saying let's go back there, right? It's saying let's remember that they were there and move forward, right? Which is why, this sort of, again, the contradictions of this ideology, which I was trying to get to, is that it's not regressive. Ab log, नाराज हो जाते हैं when I use the word progressive, because progressive is seen only in terms of a kind of liberal progressivism, right? Women's rights, so on and so forth. He's perfectly comfortable with Dalit rights or women's rights. Those would not have bothered him at all. Women's education, none of those things. There's no return. Okay? So part of the issue for me with this book was saying कि आपने सावरकर के अगर टुकड़े किए तो each टुकड़ा would appeal to somebody, and उसमें से आपने, if you removed from all of that the things he said about Muslims, you would celebrate him, bhai. He was so progressive on caste, so progressive on gender. And what I'm arguing in this book is you can't separate it. You can't separate it, all right? And I'm showing you how you can't separate it.
How popular was Savarkar in the 1940s and 50s? Or is that he is given undue respect after his death? Is he more popular amongst the far right now?
Well, in the 1940s and 50s, he was affiliated and associated with Gandhi's murder, so he was not popular. He went underground. I certainly think there's a resurgence of his popularity now.
While Savarkar is often vilified, but other freedom fighters such as Lala Lajpat Rai, Lala Hardayal, and other various freedom fighters from the Arya Samaj and Anushalan Samati like Sri Aurobindo have somewhat same views, see the Hindu identity being central to the Indian identity. What are the reasons which separate Savarkar?
From Lala Lajpat Rai and others, from Anushilan Samiti. I mean, look, if you're looking for a strand of anti-Muslim prejudice, you're going to find it everywhere. That's what I started with when I said that, all right? But it's, for me, what separates him are his writings. Lala Lajpat Rai doesn't do this kind of writing. Lala Lajpat Rai, it's also generational. Lala Lajpat Rai is a previous generation with Tilak and Bipin Chandra Pal. Okay, this is Savarkar, in a sense, is Tilak's heir, takes over from Tilak. Jinnah and Tilak. Oh, A.G. Durrani is okay. Yes.
Please ask her, is there something that wasn't planned, by the way? Please ask her, is there something in common with different movements like Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj, and the RSS? Some people argue all of them try to locate Hindu society when confronted with modernity due to colonization. How does Savarkar fall in that equation?
It doesn't. The Brahmo Samaj is a kind of Christianized Hinduism, right? Sets out, Brahmo Samaj comes about primarily to sort of eradicate sati. That's in 1828-29. It produces its own rituals. It produces a kind of Christianized ritual. So it's a reform society of the early 19th century. The RSS is not a reform society at all, and it's founded a century later in 1925. So as historians, we don't sort of leap around. We sort of, it's like saying, I can't really put Savarkar in line with three societies that are separated by 50 years each. Right? The Arya Samaj is founded in 1875. 1875. Arya Samaj then breaks in two. Does Savarkar have anything to do with the Arya Samajis? Yes and no. He's certainly in favor of the idea that there should be no restriction on doing access, what we would in today's world call access. Right? Should access to the Vedas be restricted to the Brahmins? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Right? So I think I've answered the question.
Thank you so much for your time. अगर आपको लगता है कुछ miss हो गया है, and maybe what should people's takeaway be from this conversation?
That I'm actually trying to expand the field of Indian intellectual history, right? That I have not written a biography of a figure as much as I've written an intellectual biography of a phenomenon, an ideology. And I've done it primarily because I think that the more one reads and studies figures who were prominent in their own regions, in their own language, the fuller our understanding of Indian history will be.
Thank you so much for the last 15 years. And people should read the book. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for listening.
You.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me on the show.